His hand tightened around the microphone before the first note ever left his mouth. The stadium was still breathing around him, a living animal of faces, ribbons, lights, and grief. Queen were behind him. Freddie Mercury was not. And somewhere beyond the glare, the man George Michael loved was watching a song become something much heavier than a performance. That was the part no one could see yet. The song had not started, but the wound had. He looked calm because he had trained himself to look calm. George knew how to stand inside noise and make it obey him. He knew how to smile when a camera found his face and how to keep private terror behind beautiful control. But on April 20th, 1992, Wembley did not feel like another stage. It felt like a room with one chair missing, and everyone knew whose chair it was. The old dream had turned into a test. He could feel it before the band played. Freddie had died only months earlier, and the air around Queen still carried the shape of him. Brian May, Roger Taylor, and John Deacon were not simply backing guest singers that night. They were standing inside the absence of their own brother, trying to let music do what words could not. Every song asked the same impossible question: who can sing where Freddie used to stand? No rehearsal could make that absence ordinary. George had loved Queen since childhood, the way a shy boy loves voices that seem larger than fear. Freddie was not just a singer to him. Freddie was proof that a man could turn loneliness, theater, defiance, and tenderness into something that filled an arena. But now George was being asked to sing in the space Freddie had left behind, and childhood dreams rarely arrive without a cost. He had wanted this once, not like this. That night, he was not trying to replace Freddie. He was trying to survive a song. That was the central wound of the performance. To the crowd, it was a tribute. To Queen, it was a test of memory and trust. To George, it was something even more private, because grief had already entered his own life through another door, quietly, before the applause began. The audience was waiting for brilliance. He was carrying dread. The world did not know much about Anselmo Feleppa then. It did not know what he meant to George. It did not know how carefully George guarded that love, or how dangerous honesty could still feel in the early 1990s. The audience saw a superstar stepping into a legendary song. They did not see the man singing while trying not to think about a diagnosis that had changed everything. The secret made every breath heavier. Every note had a second meaning. Freddie's death had arrived like a warning bell for an entire generation. For George, the bell rang closer to the body. He had learned that Anselmo was HIV positive, and the private terror of that knowledge lived inside him while the public still expected polish, charm, and perfect control. The stage was bright. The fear was not, and silence had become part of the burden. No spotlight could reach that part of him, not yet. So when he walked out at Wembley, he carried two ghosts at once. One was Freddie, beloved by millions, publicly mourned, turned into a legend almost before the funeral flowers had faded. The other was the possible future of the man George loved, a future he could barely say out loud. He had to sing between them, with the whole world watching and almost no one understanding. That is where the real story begins, in the gap. The first sound from him did not feel like a singer showing what he could do. It felt like someone opening a locked room. There was power in it, yes, but the power was not cold. It trembled underneath, as if the voice knew more than the face was allowed to reveal. Queen had heard many voices that day, but this one seemed to understand the wound inside the song before it reached for the notes. It was not showmanship, it was survival. Brian May would later speak with deep admiration about the quality in George's voice that night, something that seemed to touch Freddie's spirit without imitating him. That is why the performance stayed. It was not a disguise, it was not a copy. It was a man letting another man's song pass through his own grief. And for a few minutes, the stadium seemed to know the difference. That difference is why people still replay it. The camera loved the surface, the jacket, the lights, the enormous crowd, the famous band behind him. But the real image was smaller. A man in his late 20s, carrying a secret love, singing about needing someone while the person he needed stood somewhere beyond the glare. Fame can fill a stadium. It cannot hold your hand in the dark. That is what made the moment hurt. The crowd heard longing. He knew the name of it. There were moments when George seemed to lean into the song as if he were asking it a question, not performing it. Asking it, his face held that strange mixture he often had when the music became too true. Control on the outside, collapse just underneath. He could make pain sound beautiful. That was the gift. That was also the danger, because people applauded the beauty and missed the pain. And danger can sound like a miracle to strangers. Queen, too, had to stand there and feel it. They knew Freddie's phrasing, Freddie's timing, Freddie's impossible command of a crowd. They knew the places where his voice used to climb, wink, strike like lightning, and then vanish into tenderness. And then George reached those places with his own sadness, and the space behind the band seemed to go very quiet. Something had shifted. The band did not just accompany him. They listened. That is what people mean when they say, "He left Queen speechless." Not that no one could speak after the show. Not that the moment became a fairy tale. It was quieter than that. It was the kind of silence that comes when musicians recognize that someone has not merely sung the right notes, but found the hurt underneath them. Some performances impress. This one understood. It left a mark without raising its voice. That was enough. For George, the applause must have been complicated. 72,000 people can sound like love, but applause does not always know what it is touching. They were cheering the brilliance. They were cheering the tribute. They were cheering Freddie. They did not know they were also hearing a private prayer for Anselmo, hidden inside a public song and carried by a voice that could not explain itself, and he had to keep it hidden. He would later remember that performance as one of the proudest moments of his career. But pride was not the only feeling on that stage. There was honor in the way he sang for his hero, and quiet fear in the heart of a man who knew he might soon lose someone he loved. For a few minutes, both truths lived inside the same song. The cruelest part was that George could not fully explain it then. He could not walk to the front of the stage and tell the world who he was really singing to. He could not name the fear in his chest without inviting judgment, headlines, and exposure. So he did what artists do when speech becomes impossible. He hid the truth in sound, and the sound carried what the mouth could not. That is why the performance feels like confession without words. And the sound traveled farther than any confession could have. It went through Wembley, through television screens, through living rooms where people did not know the private names behind the public emotion. Many remembered the vocal power. Fewer understood the cost. The world heard a triumph. George lived it as a wound, and wounds do not end when the final note disappears. Only later would people understand what they had heard. A year later, Anselmo would be gone. The grief that had been waiting behind the song would become permanent. It would shape George's writing, his silence, his retreat from the easy version of fame. After that, love and loss were no longer subjects for him. They were rooms he had lived in with the lights off, and when he sang again, the room came with him. The echo did not leave when the crowd did. It followed him into the years after Wembley. That is why the Wembley performance has never aged like a normal concert clip. It does not feel trapped in 1992. It feels alive because the stakes inside it were real. George was singing for Freddie, yes. He was singing with Queen, yes. But he was also singing from the edge of a private future. He could not stop from arriving. The audience heard a moment. He was living a warning. That future was already moving toward him. There is a reason older viewers still talk about that night with a kind of hush. They remember the red ribbons, the huge names, the scale of it all. But when George begins that song, the spectacle narrows. The stadium becomes a room. The room becomes one person trying to reach another before time takes him away. That is the strange power of real grief. It makes an arena feel intimate. One voice made the distance collapse. And maybe that is what made Queen hear him differently. They had lost the man who could make a crowd feel invincible. George arrived with a voice that did not try to be invincible. It sounded wounded, controlled, generous, and brave. It respected Freddie by refusing to pretend Freddie could be replaced. That respect made the song bigger, because it left space for the man who was gone. Absence was allowed to remain in the music. For all his fame, George Michael's greatest moments often came when the mask slipped just enough for the pain to breathe. Wembley was one of those moments. He did not give the world a perfect impersonation. He gave it something more fragile, a man honoring a hero, protecting a lover, and standing in grief without letting it destroy the song. That is why people still return to it. The applause ended. The truth stayed with him. That night, he was not trying to replace Freddie. He was trying to survive a song. And somehow, by surviving it, he gave Freddie, Queen, Anselmo, and everyone watching a performance that still feels like a hand reaching through the dark. The voice that filled Wembley was also carrying a silence.
If this story changed the way you remember George Michael, stay with us. There are more untold chapters still hidden behind the voice, the fame, and the silence. Like the video, subscribe, and let the next story find you.